In the 19th century, washing in winter was considered dangerous. One woman decided otherwise and built a strange cabin next to her house. People laughed at her until the first harsh winter. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. Winter did not arrive here with ceremony. It did not announce itself with a storm dramatic enough to be remembered or a snowfall clean enough to be admired. It settled in the way fatigue did, quietly and persistently, day after day, until every movement required intention and every mistake carried a cost. The settlement lay exposed on the open land, a loose scattering of houses that had never pretended to be a town. There was no main road, no true center, only paths beaten into the frozen ground by years of boots and sled runners, curving instinctively toward water, toward wood, toward whatever still promised survival. Snow was never white for long. Ash from hearths drifted with the wind, mixing with dirt and trampled straw, turning the ground a dull gray that clung to heams and boots. The wind moved without obstruction, pressing against walls, prying at doors, slipping through any gap left unsealed. Trees stood farther away than people liked to admit, and every load of firewood was earned with aching shoulders and stiff fingers. Water, drawn from a shallow well and a narrow stream that sometimes froze solid, was lifted bucket by bucket, carried carefully so as not to spill even a mouthful. Nothing here was abundant, and nothing was wasted without consequence. The cold shaped behavior more reliably than any rule. People learned early what could be risked and what could not. Hunger could be endured for a day or two. Fatigue could be pushed through. But sickness was feared with a particular seriousness, because once it took hold in winter, there were few remedies and even fewer chances for rest. A man who could not work became a burden, not because he was unwanted, but because there was no excess to absorb him. A woman who fell ill lost not only her strength, but her place in the endless chain of labor that kept the household upright. This was why water in winter was treated with suspicion, not the lack of it, but its use. Washing the body meant exposure. Exposure meant cold. Cold meant sickness. The logic was simple and reinforced by memory. Stories circulated with the authority of lessons learned too late. Someone's uncle who had bathed too long and spent the night shaking with fever. A neighbor who washed her hair before dawn and never recovered her breath. These stories were told without embellishment, passed along like warnings, etched into the air itself. By the time winter arrived in earnest, no one needed to repeat them aloud. They were already understood. Hands were washed because they had to be. Faces were wiped because sleep demanded it. Beyond that, the body was left alone. Dirt was tolerated. Sweat dried into fabric and skin alike. It was not considered neglect, but adaptation. Cleanliness, as it was spoken of here, meant the absence of visible filth and unbearable odor. Anything more was indulgence, and indulgence in winter was a form of foolishness. Men returned from the fields and the forest with their clothes stiff from dried sweat and mud, their skin cracked along the knuckles, sometimes bleeding into the cold air without comment. They bore it with a kind of grim pride, as if endurance itself were proof of worth. The work required it. Fences had to be mended even when the ground resisted the post hole. Animals needed feeding no matter how sharp the wind cut across the yard. Wood needed splitting regardless of how slow the axe felt in numb hands. A man who complained about dirt was a man who didn't understand the place he lived. Yet the consequences were there, even if they were rarely spoken of directly. Inflamed cuts festered. Old injuries ached more fiercely in winter, joints swelling beneath layers of cloth. Skin rashes appeared and disappeared, sometimes lingering long enough to trouble sleep. These things were accepted as part of the season, inconveniences to be endured rather than problems to be solved. Women carried their own burdens quietly. Laundry was done sparingly, water reused until it turned gray and heavy. Children were wiped clean by the fire, their small bodies shivering despite every effort to keep the cloth warm. Mothers watched for signs of illness with a vigilance sharpened by experience, knowing how little stood between a simple chill and something far worse. They spoke softly about these fears, if at all, because fear itself was considered dangerous. It unsettled the routine, and routine was what kept people moving. At the edge of the settlement lived a woman named Eliza Moore. Her house stood slightly apart, not because she sought isolation, but because the land there had been cheaper when her husband chose it years before. He had said the distance would not matter. He had been wrong in many ways, though she did not blame him for all of them. He was gone now, taken not by violence or accident, but by a winter illness that began with a cough and ended with a silence she still noticed at night. Eliza did not speak of it often. Loss, like dirt, was something the frontier taught people to carry without display. She rose each morning before the light strengthened enough to soften the frost on the windows. She worked as everyone else did, drawing water, tending her small plot, mending what could be mended. To most eyes, she was unremarkable, another woman surviving because she had no other option. What set her apart was not defiance, but attention. She noticed things others passed over because they had long ago decided nothing could be changed. She noticed how long it took for a body to stop shaking after being exposed to cold water. She noticed how children grew quieter in winter, how they rubbed their arms even indoors. She noticed how the air itself seemed to steal heat the moment skin was uncovered. These observations did not arrive as ideas, but as accumulations, settling slowly in her mind. One evening, as she wiped her hands with a damp cloth by the hearth, she thought of her daughter. The memory did not strike suddenly, but came the way cold seeped through walls, gradually and without permission. The girl had been small for her age, quick to laugh, slower to recover from chills. One winter, years ago now, Eliza had insisted on washing her properly after a fever broke, believing that cleanliness would help her heal. The water had been warm at first, but the room cold, the air unyielding. By morning, the fever had returned, stronger than before. The doctor came too late, and the girl was buried before the ground fully thawed. No one had blamed Eliza. No one had spoken of it directly. The conclusion had been simple and final. Winter was not the time for such things. Eliza had accepted that explanation then, because there had been no alternative to accept. But now, years later, as she sat alone with the quiet crackle of the fire, the memory did not bring grief so much as unease. Not guilt, but a question she had never allowed herself to form. What if the danger had not been the water itself, but the way it had been used? What if the cold had not been an unavoidable force, but something that could be held at bay, even briefly? She did not think in terms of inventions or solutions. Those were words for people with leisure and tools she did not possess. She thought instead of moments, the instant when warm water touched skin and relief followed. The instant when the cloth cooled and the body tightened in response. The problem, she realized, was not the act of washing, but the exposure that followed it. The body was asked to endure too much, too suddenly. Eliza rose from her chair and walked to the door, opening it just enough to feel the night air press against her face. It was sharp, immediate, unforgiving. She closed the door again and leaned against it, feeling the contrast between the cold outside and the modest warmth within. The house, small as it was, protected her. It slowed the loss of heat. It made survival possible. The thought was simple, almost embarrassingly so. If a house could hold warmth, why not a smaller space? If warmth could be preserved for hours in thick walls, why not for minutes in a place designed for it? Why was washing always done in the open, or in rooms that were never meant to be warm? She knew the answers people would give if she asked them. Because water was scarce. Because firewood was precious. Because risk was unacceptable. But those answers assumed excess. They assumed a great deal of water, a great deal of heat, a great deal of exposure. What if none of those were required? Eliza returned to her chair and sat without moving for a long time. Outside, the wind pushed against the walls, searching for weakness. Inside, the fire settled into a steady glow. She did not feel excitement or resolve. What she felt was a narrowing of focus, the kind that came when a thought refused to be dismissed. She was not planning change. She was simply unwilling, for the first time, to accept that nothing could be done. By morning, the cold would still be there. The labor would still demand its due. The settlement would continue as it always had, governed by the same fears and the same assumptions. But something had shifted quietly within her, as imperceptible as the first thin layer of ice forming on water, left undisturbed overnight. She rose before dawn and began her day as usual, carrying water, feeding the fire, moving through familiar motions. To anyone watching, nothing had changed. Yet as she worked, her eyes lingered on the corner of the yard where the ground dipped slightly, sheltered from the wind by the side of the house. She imagined walls there, not high, not wide, but close. A place where heat would not escape so easily. A place where water could be used without inviting the cold to claim the body that stood beneath it. The idea did not yet have shape or name. It was only a question, persistent and quiet, waiting for the moment when it would demand to be answered. The idea followed Eliza through the days that came after, not as a clear plan, but as a pressure that refused to ease. It accompanied her to the well, where the rope burned her palms through her gloves, and into the shed, where she split kindling with movements learned long before thought was required. Each task carried its own rhythm, but beneath it ran the same quiet calculation. Where did the heat go? Where did it escape? How much was truly needed, and how much was lost simply because no one had ever tried to keep it? She did not speak of it. On the frontier, ideas announced too early were treated the same way as mistakes. They attracted attention, and attention invited correction. Eliza worked instead, watching, measuring by instinct. She noticed how quickly warmth gathered in enclosed spaces, how even a thin wall cut the wind enough to change the feel of the air. She noticed how the earth itself, when packed tightly, resisted the cold better than boards that shrank and split as the temperature dropped. The place she had looked at the morning after her realization began to take on meaning. It was a narrow strip of ground along the side of her house, sheltered from the worst of the wind by the wall and the slope of the land. Snow gathered there differently, less scoured, more settled. It seemed, in a way she could not yet explain, willing to hold warmth rather than surrender it. Her first efforts were tentative. She did not begin with construction, but with preparation. She gathered clay from a low spot near the stream, where the earth remained workable even in winter, mixing it with straw she had saved from the last harvest. Her hands remembered the work from years past, patching walls, sealing gaps. The mixture took shape slowly, stiff and heavy, resisting the cold that tried to steal its pliability. When she finally began to build, it was with no audience. She worked early in the morning and late in the afternoon, hours when most others were occupied with their own survival. The walls rose low at first, packed earth reinforced with straw, thick enough to block wind, but narrow enough to conserve space. She made the structure small deliberately. Not a room, not a shed, but something closer. something that would trap air and refuse to let it escape. As the walls grew, curiosity followed. A neighbor paused once on his way past, watching in silence before shaking his head and moving on. Another laughed openly, asking if she planned to build herself a second privy. Eliza answered neither. Words would not help her here. The shape she was creating did not yet justify explanation. The door came last, a simple slab fitted tight enough to close without gaps. Inside, the space was narrow, barely wide enough to turn around comfortably. That was the point. Eliza stepped inside for the first time and closed the door behind her, standing still as her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The air felt different immediately. Not warm, exactly, but contained. The wind could not reach her here. The thought settled deeper. The next challenge was water. She had known from the beginning that this would be the most difficult part to explain, even to herself. The frontier's distrust of washing was rooted not only in fear of cold, but in the undeniable cost of water itself. Carrying it was labor. Heating it was labor piled upon labor. Any system that demanded excess would be dismissed before it could be tested. This was why she rejected the idea of large containers. A full tub would require too much water and too much heat. Instead, she chose a small barrel, one that had once held grain. She sealed it carefully, darkening the exterior with pitch to protect the wood and help it absorb whatever warmth it could. When she placed it atop the structure, fitting it into the roof so that part of its base sat just above the enclosed space, she felt the first stirrings of something like certainty. The barrel held little. Enough, perhaps, for a single person to wash quickly. That was all she intended. She bored small holes near the bottom and fashioned a crude stopper that could be pulled and replaced with one hand. It was not elegant. It was not meant to be. Heat, she knew, could not be applied directly to the water without inviting danger. Boiling a barrel of water would require more fuel than anyone here could spare. Instead, she turned her attention to the wall itself. She built a small stove against one side of the structure, so small it looked almost ridiculous beside the heavy iron beasts people used to heat their homes. This one was meant for steadiness, not force. Its purpose was not to flood the air with heat, but to warm the earth-packed wall it touched. Her first trials were disappointing. The stove smoked too much, the draft poorly controlled. The interior warmed unevenly, and the water remained stubbornly cold. She adjusted, sealing cracks, reshaping the flue, learning how little fire was required to coax warmth into the wall without wasting fuel. Slowly, the structure began to behave differently. The earth absorbed the heat and held it, releasing it back into the air long after the fire had burned down. Still, the water was not right. It chilled too quickly once it began to flow. Eliza stood inside the narrow space one evening, hands numb, and understood what she had been avoiding. The water itself needed help, but only a little. Not a great expense, not a roaring fire, but something precise. The solution came not as inspiration, but as admission. She did not need to heat all the water. She only needed to remove its cruelty. A small pot, brought to a boil on her kitchen stove, would be enough. 1 or 2 ladles poured carefully into the barrel just before use. The volume was small, but the effect immediate. The water lost its bite. It became tolerable, then almost gentle. She tested the system on herself, cautiously at first. She built the fire small, letting the wall warm gradually. She carried the pot of boiling water outside, poured it into the barrel, closed the lid, and stepped inside the structure. The door shut behind her with a dull sound, sealing out the night air. When she pulled the stopper, the water fell in a thin stream, warm enough to surprise her, not enough to shock. She washed quickly, stopping the flow as she lathered, starting it again only to rinse. The air inside remained still, the warmth lingering against her skin. When she finished and opened the door, she did not shiver. Her body retained its heat, as if reluctant to surrender it to the cold beyond the walls. She stood there for a long moment, water dripping onto the packed earth floor, and understood that what she had built was neither bath nor luxury. It was shelter applied to the act of washing. The simplicity of it left her almost uneasy. The settlement noticed the change before it understood it. Smoke rising from the small stove drew attention. The barrel on the roof invited questions. Laughter followed, predictable and loud. People repeated the truths they believed unassailable. Water was labor. Heat was firewood. Winter was not the season for such things. Eliza listened without argument. She had learned already that proof would not come from words. There were still problems. The barrel leaked once and had to be resealed. The door warped slightly in the cold and needed planing. She adjusted and corrected, each change making the structure more reliable. She refined the process until it became a routine rather than an experiment. Small fire, short wait, a little boiling water, quick wash, warm body. She did not invite anyone to try it. She knew better than to challenge the settlement openly. People here trusted results, not explanations. And results required patience. One evening, as she finished her work and carried the empty pot back into the house, she heard footsteps outside. A man paused near the structure, his presence heavy with hesitation. He did not speak, and neither did she. They stood on opposite sides of the wall, separated by packed earth and unspoken doubt. At last he moved on, leaving behind a silence that felt different from before. Eliza closed her door and banked her fire for the night. She knew the questions were coming. She knew the laughter would fade only when necessity intervened. Winter was tightening its grip, and with it would come the moment when endurance alone would no longer be enough. The structure stood quietly beside her house, dark and unassuming, holding within it a small, stubborn warmth. It was not yet accepted, not yet understood. But it existed now, and that, she sensed, would soon matter more than anyone expected. By the time the cold reached its deepest point, the settlement had grown quieter. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of conservation, as if every word spoken needed to justify the energy it consumed. People moved more slowly, spoke less, and avoided anything that was not strictly necessary. The novelty of Eliza's small structure had faded into the background, becoming just another oddity people passed without comment, like a fence built crookedly or a roof patched with mismatched boards. What had not faded was illness. It did not arrive all at once. It never did. It began with stiffness in the joints, hands that would not close fully in the morning, skin that cracked and bled despite careful wrapping. Then came the deeper troubles, a festering cut that refused to heal, a cough that lingered longer than it should, an ache that settled into the body and did not leave. None of these were unusual on their own, but together they began to slow the settlement's rhythm. Among those affected was Thomas Reed, a man known for his endurance more than his temper. He had lived on the frontier longer than most, arriving young and staying because he no longer knew how to live anywhere else. His body bore the marks of that choice. Old scars crossed his forearms, some from tools that slipped, others from winters that bit too hard. He worked without complaint and expected the same from others. If anyone had laughed the loudest at Eliza's structure, it had been Thomas. He had said it openly one evening near the fire, that washing in winter was foolishness dressed up as cleverness. Water, he said, would always steal more heat than it gave back. He had survived long enough to know that. People had nodded, relieved to hear their own thoughts spoken with confidence. Now Thomas was struggling. It began with a wound on his lower leg, a scrape earned while hauling timber. Normally, it would have closed within days. Instead, it reddened, then swelled. The skin around it grew hot to the touch, even as the rest of him felt cold. He kept working, wrapping it tighter, ignoring the dull throb that followed him into sleep. Washing it properly would have meant exposing himself to the cold longer than he was willing to risk. He wiped it as best he could, and hoped time would do the rest. It did not. By the time he could no longer ignore the pain, his strength had begun to fail him in smaller ways. He tired more quickly. He moved stiffly. His nights were restless, broken by feverish dreams he did not remember clearly in the morning. Others noticed, though no one spoke of it directly. Weakness was something you waited out, not something you named. Thomas waited until waiting was no longer an option. The morning he finally turned toward Eliza's house, the sky was a flat, unbroken gray. Snow crunched under his boots, each step deliberate. He told himself he was only going to ask a question, nothing more. Curiosity, he decided, was not the same as surrender. Eliza saw him coming through the small window beside her door. She did not react immediately. She had known this moment would come, though she had not known when or who would be first. She finished what she was doing, set her hands on the table, and waited. When Thomas knocked, it was with the flat of his hand, firm but hesitant. Eliza opened the door without surprise. They stood facing each other, the cold air pressing in between them. "I need to wash," he said at last. The words sounded awkward in his mouth, as if they belonged to someone else. Eliza did not ask why. She did not remind him of what he had said before. She simply stepped aside and let him enter. The warmth inside the house struck him immediately, and with it came a faint sense of shame he could not quite explain. She listened as he spoke, not interrupting, letting him say what he needed to say in his own way. He mentioned the wound without dramatizing it. He spoke of stiffness, of nights that did not bring rest. He did not ask for help outright. He simply waited. Eliza nodded once. "We do it the same way every time," she said, "if you don't rush it." They stepped outside together. The structure stood as it always had, plain and narrow, its earthen walls dark against the snow. Thomas looked at it more closely than he ever had before. It was smaller than he remembered, tighter, less foolish than he had assumed. Eliza lit the small stove with practiced movements. The fire caught quickly, the flame modest, controlled. She did not add more wood than necessary. Thomas watched, his skepticism shifting into something quieter, more attentive. Inside the house, she set a pot of water over the fire. They waited as it heated, neither speaking. When it reached a boil, she lifted it carefully and carried it outside. The steam rose briefly, then vanished into the cold air. She climbed the short ladder and poured the boiling water into the barrel, the sound muffled and hollow. The lid was replaced, the ladder moved aside. Everything was done without ceremony, without explanation. "Not all at once," she said, as they stood before the door. "You stop it when you need to." Thomas nodded. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The space was dim, the air already warmer than he expected. He stood still for a moment, listening to his own breath. The walls felt close, but not confining. They held the warmth in a way he had never experienced outside of a proper bathhouse, and even those had been rare in his life. When he pulled the stopper, the water fell in a narrow stream. He flinched instinctively, bracing for the bite of cold. It didn't come. The water was not hot, but it was not cruel. It touched his skin and stayed there, long enough for sensation to register without pain. He washed carefully, stopping the flow when he needed to, letting the warmth of the air do its work. The wound on his leg stung briefly, then eased. He felt the tension in his shoulders begin to loosen, a sensation so unfamiliar it startled him more than the water had. Time passed differently inside the structure, not faster or slower, but steadier. When he finished and opened the door, the cold waited outside as it always had, but his body did not surrender its heat immediately. He stepped out, steam rising faintly from his skin, and realized with a strange clarity that he was not shaking. Eliza watched without comment. She handed him a cloth, and he dried himself quickly. The wound looked cleaner, less angry. He dressed and stood there for a moment, unsure what to say. The true test came not that day, but the next. Thomas woke expecting the familiar ache, the heaviness that had settled into his limbs over the past weeks. Instead, he felt something closer to readiness. The pain in his leg had not vanished, but it had dulled. He rose, dressed, and went to work. By midday, people had noticed. He did not speak of what he had done. He did not defend it or explain it. He simply continued, day after day, moving with a steadiness that had been absent before. When asked, he shrugged, said little, let the evidence stand on its own. Whispers began to circulate. Not laughter this time, but cautious curiosity. Someone mentioned that Thomas seemed better. Someone else remarked that he had not missed a day's work. The structure by Eliza's house gained new attention, no longer mocked openly, but watched. A woman came one morning, her eyes downcast, asking quietly if she might use it for her child. Eliza agreed, repeating the same instructions she had given Thomas. Small fire, little water. A ladle of boiling water, no more. The child emerged, flushed, but calm, not trembling. The settlement did not change overnight. Beliefs built over years do not dissolve after a single example. But something had cracked. The certainty that winter washing always led to sickness no longer held its shape. People began to consider the possibility that the danger lay not in the act itself, but in how it was done. Eliza continued as she had before, making no effort to persuade, offering no arguments. She understood now that the frontier did not trust ideas. It trusted survival. And survival, slowly and undeniably, was beginning to speak for her. By the time the cold began to loosen its hold, no one spoke of Eliza's structure as if it were a curiosity anymore. It had become part of the landscape, like the well or the woodpile, something that existed because it was useful. The laughter that had once followed it faded without ceremony, replaced not by praise, but by a careful silence that signaled reconsideration. On the frontier, acceptance rarely arrived as acknowledgement. It arrived as imitation. The deepest weeks of winter were the hardest. Snow lay packed and gray, the ground unyielding beneath it. The wind returned often, cutting across the open land, with a familiarity that suggested it had never truly left. Illness moved through the settlement in uneven patterns, sparing some and lingering with others. But the nature of that illness had begun to shift. The small, festering problems that once spread unchecked were fewer. People healed more quickly. Children slept more soundly. These changes were noticed not as miracles, but as absences, the lack of things that had once been expected. At first, those who came to Eliza did so quietly. They arrived before dawn or after nightfall, their footsteps careful on the frozen ground. A woman would knock softly, eyes lowered, asking if she might use the structure for herself or her child. A man would come with his cap in his hands, saying little, waiting to be told what to do. Eliza never turned anyone away, and she never hurried them. She repeated the same instructions every time, patient and unchanging. The fire was kept small. The water was kept scarce. The boiling water was added only at the end, never more than necessary. The washing was brief, deliberate, controlled. Those who used the structure learned quickly that it was not indulgence being offered, but order. There was no room for excess inside those earthen walls. Everything had its purpose. The heat stayed where it was needed. The water flowed only when it served the body. The cold was kept outside, waiting, denied entry for a few crucial minutes. As word spread, the visits grew less secretive. People began to come in daylight, no longer concerned with who might see them. The structure's door opened and closed more frequently, its presence acknowledged without comment. Eliza noticed how those who left it walked differently, not lighter exactly, but steadier. They did not rush to cover themselves. They did not shiver. Their bodies retained what warmth they had been given, as if reluctant to surrender it again. The true change came not when people began to use Eliza's structure, but when they began to build their own. It started with a small imitation at the far end of the settlement, a rough enclosure packed with earth and straw, smaller even than Eliza's. The barrel on its roof was not sealed as well, the stove crudely shaped, but the principle was there. Then another appeared, and another, each one slightly different, each adapted to the materials and understanding of its builder. No one asked Eliza for permission or credit. No one thanked her openly. They did not need to. The frontier had its own way of recognizing what worked. With the spread of these small cabins came a subtle shift in the rhythm of daily life. Washing was no longer postponed indefinitely during winter. It became something that could be done when needed, without fear. People took greater care of wounds. Children were cleaned more regularly. The air inside homes felt different, less heavy with the accumulated smells of unwashed bodies and damp cloth. None of this was spoken of directly. It did not need to be. Eliza watched these changes from a distance, continuing her routines without alteration. She did not correct others' designs or suggest improvements. She understood that each person needed to trust their own hands, their own walls, their own fire. What mattered was not precision, but restraint. The lesson, once learned, was difficult to forget. The settlement did not become healthier overnight. Winter still took its toll. People still fell ill. Work remained hard, and loss remained a constant companion. But there was a difference now, one that could be felt, even if it was rarely named. The fear surrounding water had softened. It no longer represented an unavoidable risk, but a tool that could be used carefully, intelligently. As the days lengthened and the sun climbed higher, the snow began to retreat. The ground softened, releasing the smells of damp earth and old straw. Paths that had been frozen into place shifted underfoot. People moved more freely, their steps lighter, not because the work had lessened, but because the season allowed it. One morning, Eliza stood outside her house and watched steam rise from more than one small stove across the settlement. The sight struck her more deeply than she expected. It was not pride she felt, but a quiet confirmation. What she had built had not remained hers. It had entered the shared understanding of the place, altering it in small but lasting ways. No one spoke of invention. No one framed what had happened as progress. On the frontier, survival was not improved through grand declarations, but through adjustments so practical they eventually ceased to be noticed. By the time spring fully arrived, the small washing cabins were already taken for granted, as if they had always existed. Eliza dismantled nothing. She kept her structure as it was, repairing it when needed, using it when the weather demanded caution. She did not explain its origin to anyone who did not ask, and few did. The story of how it came to be was less important than the fact that it remained. On a clear afternoon, with the snow nearly gone, she walked the edge of the settlement, passing homes that bore the marks of winter's passage. She saw people working, mending, preparing for the seasons ahead. There was no celebration, no moment of collective acknowledgement. The frontier did not pause to reflect on what it had learned. It moved forward because it had to. As she returned to her house, Eliza paused beside the structure, resting her hand against its packed wall. It was warm to the touch, holding on to the remnants of the morning fire. She thought of the fear that had once governed every decision about water and cold. She thought of how quietly that fear had been dismantled, not through argument, but through care. The lesson, she knew, would persist long after the details were forgotten. People would remember that winter did not forbid cleanliness, only carelessness. They would remember that warmth, once held, could be shared without waste. They would remember that survival was not merely a matter of endurance, but of attention. Eliza stepped inside her house and closed the door behind her. Outside, the season turned as it always did, indifferent to human effort. Inside, the warmth lingered, modest and sufficient, exactly as she had learned to keep it. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming next. Share this video with someone who might appreciate it.